Hello, Fright Family. How's everyone doing today? Ready for another spine-tingling yet relaxing video? I hope you're as excited as I am to dive into some chilling tales. If you're enjoying these videos, don't forget to hit that subscribe button if you haven't yet, and I'd love to hear from you in the comments. What's been your favorite story so far? Sit back, relax, and let's dive into the scare together. Growing up in the same neighborhood your whole life, you get to know the people in the place really well. But what happened one night made me seriously consider moving out. I lived in this neighborhood from elementary school through college. It was close to everything I needed, with friendly neighbors and 3 nice parks just around the corner. One of our neighbors, we'll call them the Smiths, was an older couple who mostly kept to themselves. Their house was a 2-story that sat higher up than ours, so from their backyard you could look right into ours. Sometimes, late at night, I'd get a strange feeling when I'd let my dog out and see Mrs. Smith standing in her backyard in the dark, just staring. I'd call out to her, asking if she was okay, but she never responded. Occasionally, I'd see Mr. Smith gently guide her back inside, and I assumed it was something like memory issues that caused her to wander out like that. In 2016, not long after the first Deadpool movie was released, Mrs. Smith passed away, and her husband followed soon after. Their house went up for sale, but it sat on the market for months. Without the Smiths there, the place felt strange to me. Maybe it was because of everything that happened, but I started to get a feeling like there was something more lingering in the house. Then one night, something happened that I still think about to this day. My little brother was out with his friends, like usual, and I'd fallen asleep watching TV. It was around 2 a.m. when I woke up and headed to the bathroom. As I passed the living room, I saw my brother sitting there, visibly shaken and crying, his face pale. My mom and dad were beside him, asking things like, "What do you mean it talked?" and "Are you sure that's what you saw?" When I asked what was going on, they told me not to worry and just to go back to bed. Still half asleep, I brushed it off, finished up in the bathroom, and went back to bed. The next morning, my brother stayed home from school, and I asked my mom what had happened. She said he'd seen something in the Smith's backyard that scared him so much he couldn't stop crying. My dad had even gone out with a flashlight to check, but nothing was there. When I got home from my classes later that day, my brother was sitting in my room waiting for me. I told him I'd seen him crying last night and asked him if he wanted to talk about it. He looked at me with an expression I'd never seen before, an intensity and fear that didn't feel like him at all. I just reassured him, saying he didn't have to tell me if he didn't want to. But then he swallowed hard and began to speak, telling me about what he'd seen. He said his friend Andrew had dropped him off, and instead of coming through the front, he'd gone around to the side door to avoid waking up Mom and Dad. As he was walking up, he looked over into the Smith's backyard and saw a big animal with black and orange fur. He stopped and stared at it, and then, he said, it started speaking. The animal's mouth stayed closed, but he could hear a voice in his head. The voice knew his name, where he'd been, and what he'd been doing. He said the creature's eyes were red, fading into black. Terrified, he managed to unlock the door, get inside, and shut it behind him. He stood there, covered in goosebumps, and then he just started crying and couldn't stop. That's when Mom and Dad woke up and came to check on him, around the same time I'd woken up and seen the whole scene. I hugged him and told him I was sorry he'd experienced something so terrifying. The story gave me chills. Whatever he'd seen out there wasn't ordinary. What really got to me was that the Smiths never had a dog, and the only way any animal could get into that backyard was by jumping the spiked steel gate they had. After hours of searching on YouTube, Google, and Reddit, I started thinking he might have had an encounter with what people call a dark spirit or a phantom creature. These beings are sometimes drawn to places where recent passings have happened. It's still hard for me to fully wrap my mind around it, but I trust my brother completely, and I know he's telling the truth, and that's what unsettles me the most. I'm not exactly sure what I saw out there, but whatever it was, it decided to let me go, and for that, I'm beyond grateful. I'm the type who loves exploring the woods, especially at night. Sometimes, if I can't sleep, I'll head out to build survival shelters or just take in the quiet of the night. I live in a small town in southern Minnesota, surrounded by clusters of woods and prairie patches. Our biggest forest area is about a 30-minute drive out and covers nearly 1,000 acres, but last night I stayed closer to home. For a bit of context, I'm 6 feet 2 inches, part Native American, and usually love the thrill of being out in nature alone, whether that's a dark forest, open prairie, or an empty part of town. So, trust me when I say I'm not easily spooked. Anyway, last night I couldn't get to sleep, probably because I was excited about a date I have lined up. So, I decided to take a walk in the nearby nature park, just to burn off some energy. Like always, I took my phone, a few tools, and my BB gun with me, just in case I ran into any animals or suspicious people. As I was making my way down the trail, everything felt off. It was eerily silent. I could hear only the wind in the trees, the soft sprinkle of rain, and the crunch of my own footsteps. At first, I didn't think much of it. I'm used to silence out there sometimes, but then I started to feel like something was watching me. That's when I thought, maybe I'm walking into a predator's territory. And I slowed down a little, trying to listen. A couple of faint bird calls from a distance broke the silence, which was a small comfort. I kept moving toward my hidden campsite, taking it slower than usual, scanning the woods with every step. Then, off to my left, I noticed movement, something big. My instincts kicked in immediately, and I reached for one of my knives, gripping my backpack tightly in my other hand. Usually, if you don't bother things in the woods, they'll leave you alone. So, I kept my pace, cautiously moving forward. Another 40 yards or so, and I finally got a decent look. Whatever it was taller than me, and I was standing on ground that was at least 10 feet higher than it. Its eyes met mine, and I felt an intense wave of unease. This wasn't a chance encounter, it was watching me, sizing me up, and there was a strange understanding that I was not welcome. The woods were dead silent except for my footsteps and the occasional snap of branches underfoot. But then, from somewhere close by, I heard this deep, rhythmic thud, thud, thud coming from the right. My gut told me I had to go, and fast. I dropped my knife and pack to lighten the load and started backing away slowly, keeping my eyes on the creature. I made it to the edge of the prairie, and that's when I turned to walk away. About 10 seconds later, I heard a loud, bone-chilling call, like nothing I'd ever heard before. It sounded almost like a warning. I turned, and there they were, 3 of them, standing together, all looking at me. It was like they were making sure I knew I'd crossed a line. I kept backing up until I was close to my dirt bike, climbed on, and got out of there as fast as I could. My heart was still pounding as I sped down the path, leaving the forest behind. Only later did I realize just how close I might have come to real danger. I'd only noticed 2 of them at first, and it was clear they were skilled at staying hidden until they wanted to be seen. Looking back, I'm grateful they decided to let me go, because it felt like a close call. They could have surrounded me before I'd even realized it. So, if you're planning to head out on Halloween night for a little thrill in the woods, keep your eyes open and trust your instincts. You never know who or what might be watching from the shadows. His story takes place around 2009 to 2010, during a pretty chaotic time in my life, so I can't recall the exact date. For a bit of context, this all happened in the Albertville-Boaz area in Alabama, where I wasn't originally from. I had a good friend, let's call him George, who, along with his family, took me in when I was about 18 and still figuring things out. George and his wife, who we'll call Kelly, were part of a local paranormal investigation group, which I joined since I'd always been interested in that kind of thing. Kelly had a stepson, let's call him Jim, who was around my age, and we hit it off immediately. Kelly also ran a newspaper route on certain Friday and Saturday nights, which Jim and I sometimes took over. One Friday night, with no investigations planned, Jim and I decided to do the paper route together. We left the house around 10:30 or 11 p.m., drove to Sardis to pick up the papers, and began our route, which started in Boaz, took us through some back roads, and ended in Albertville. The night was going smoothly. We were playing music, cruising along, and just having a great time. Around 1:15 or 1:30 a.m., we reached a particularly dark, remote area along the route where the two towns meet. We turned onto a gravel road leading to a dead end where we had a few deliveries to make. We turned down the music, drove down the gravel road, and pulled up near a few houses surrounded by thick woods. As we were placing the last papers in a mailbox, we heard a deep, guttural shriek coming from the woods behind us. Jim asked if I'd heard it too, and just as I confirmed, we heard it again. Closer this time, as if whatever it was had moved to the edge of the woods just 100 yards away. At that point, Jim decided we were finished there and started driving off. But as we picked up speed, we heard the same unsettling noise once again, this time right behind us. I looked over at Jim, only to realize he was staring out the window beside me, not at me. When I followed his gaze, I saw it, a dark shape running alongside us. It was so black that it seemed to absorb all the light around it, silhouetted even against the night. It looked somewhat like a large wildcat, but with a tattered look, like something with shredded, shadowy fur. There were no visible legs, but it was moving incredibly fast. As we approached a stop sign where the gravel road met a paved one, Jim slowed down slightly, and the creature pulled slightly ahead of us. Just as we reached the sign, it seemed to leap effortlessly over it, and as it did, it turned its head toward us, revealing a single, large, fiery, orange-red eye that burned through the darkness. As we came to a full stop, it darted off to the right, letting out one final, chilling shriek before disappearing into the night. Fortunately, our route took us left, and we finished the rest of our deliveries in record time, getting back to the house by 3 a.m., much earlier than usual. We planned to wake George and tell him what we'd seen, but when we pulled up, he was already on the porch, almost as if he'd been waiting. He looked like he was about to say something, but stopped when he saw our faces, asking what was wrong instead. We told him everything, and he started asking for details, what time it happened, the exact location, and so on. After we'd given him everything we could remember, he took a deep breath, looked at Jim, and said, "Well, I'm sorry to tell you this, but something terrible happened to a man named Rick earlier this morning." Rick was a former member of the paranormal group, someone I hadn't met because he'd left the group a year or so before I joined. It turned out that during their time with the group, Rick and his partner, who we'll call Lisa, had gotten involved with some really dark stuff, experimenting with things that were strictly off limits for everyone else. They'd had a lot of strange and troubling experiences because of it, which ultimately caused them to leave the group and even put strain on their relationship. Earlier that night, around 1 a.m., Rick had gone over to Lisa's place, hoping to convince her to take him back. According to Lisa, he was acting erratically, but at times would seem eerily focused. After an hour of him refusing to leave and causing a scene, Lisa told him she'd called for help, hoping it would make him go. She said he got very quiet, and after a few moments of silence, she assumed he'd left. Help arrived around 1:30 a.m., but when Lisa went to open the door, she found Rick had passed away there on the porch. Lisa's house, as it happens, was along the same road where our gravel road met the paved one, about 2 miles to the right, exactly the direction that dark figure had headed when it left us. George believed that Rick hadn't fully distanced himself from those dark practices, and that what we'd seen was some kind of entity arriving to collect on whatever debts he'd left behind. I've had a few strange experiences in my life, but this one remains one of the most unforgettable. In 1999, I was installing one of my children's museum exhibits in Staten Island, and they put me up on the campus, which had been an old U.S. Navy retirement village compound called Sailor's Snug Harbor, if I recall. Every day for 2 weeks, I took the ferry over from Manhattan, staring at the Twin Towers and thinking, maybe I'll visit this weekend if I finish in time. Anyway, I was given the use of a retired admiral rank house, a standalone brick Georgian, circa 1835. The large campus had several civic buildings for the residents, the library, a grand hall, parade grounds, and of course a large hospital and graveyard. After all, this was the final port of call for our men in blue. During my stay, an independent film crew needed several exterior shots, a carriage arriving and leaving, actors getting in and out, walking towards my house, etc., so they had rented it for the day. My museum day was just as long as a film crew day, 12 to 18 hours. So as I was leaving in the early morning, the PAs were just coming in to set up the location. I'm a movie props maker, but had to stick to my own lane. When I got home that night, the film crew was gone. In and out just like they promised, and I was $100 richer, despite it not being my house at all. The location manager was visibly relieved at the low price, so I told them that I was a local 16IA guy from the West Coast. And since our days matched, and I wasn't expecting any compensation during my stay, I was happy. I'm sure people try to angle for a higher location fee when they hear who the actors are going to be, a recent 007 Bond villain. The company PAs left a small amount of production détruits, a partially full trash bag, and a bunch of those short little water bottles that hold maybe 2 big swallows, sitting here and there all around the house, with barely half a swallow taken out, the discarded twist cap sitting nearby, and a bunch of big summertime houseflies. The crew or actors might have had food inside. In any case, the front door would have been propped open most of the day. I got the impression they had been recording dialogue in the house. Read a line, take a sip of water, read more lines, ask for another bottle, sort of thing. Tired as I was, the noisome noise of 2 or 3 𝗕𝘂𝘀𝗀-sized flies in the bedroom was keeping me awake. They seemed to be drinking from the open bottles when I turned on the lights, so I got up and put the lids on the 4 or 5 that had been left in the bedroom. Then I opened the window facing the streetlight and turned off the bedroom lights. A few minutes later, I shut the window and went to bed in silence, only to be awakened sometime in the middle of the night by the sounds of the washing machine going through a cycle down in the basement. You know, fill, agitate, stop, empty, spin, rinse, fill, repeat, etc. I went down in the morning to see what the deal was. Ancient basement. It had a finished floor, but barely. Dangling bare bulbs, psycho-style, and 2 ordinary-looking laundry machines, a washer and dryer hooked up with modern fittings. I opened the lid, and to my amazement, the washer drum was full to the top with that sand and glacier gravel just like you find all over New York State when you pop a shovel in the ground. I went back upstairs to get ready for work and saw one big dead housefly floating on its back inside one of the bottles I sealed. It felt creepy. One night, my uncle decided to stop by his favorite local bar after a long week of work. It was one of those dimly lit, cozy places where the bartender knew most of the regulars by name and even remembered their usual orders. My uncle wasn't particularly looking for company. He just wanted a drink and a bit of time to unwind. But as he sat down at the bar, a man beside him struck up a conversation. The man seemed genuinely friendly and easygoing. He was well-spoken, charming in a subtle way, and had an easy smile that made my uncle feel at ease. They started talking about everything and anything that crossed their minds, from the weather to the latest sports scores, and even a little bit about their lives. My uncle remembered thinking it was unusual to feel that comfortable with a complete stranger, especially in a bar. But something about this man made him feel relaxed. Over the next few weeks, they bumped into each other again at the bar a few more times. Each time they would chat, sometimes for hours, sharing stories, laughing at jokes, and occasionally opening up about life's struggles and dreams. My uncle didn't learn too much personal information about him. The guy was somewhat private, but he figured everyone has their boundaries. Still, my uncle grew to genuinely like him. In fact, he even mentioned the man to a couple of family members, describing him as a really nice guy he'd been chatting with at the bar. Then, one evening, my uncle went to the bar, hoping to see his friend and catch up. But the man wasn't there. My uncle shrugged it off, thinking he probably had other plans that night. But as weeks went by, and then months, he noticed that he hadn't seen his friend in quite a while. He asked the bartender about him, but nobody seemed to know much about where the man had gone. Maybe he'd moved to another city or found a new favorite bar, my uncle thought. Life moved on, and the memory of his friend became just one of those casual encounters that drift away with time. Months later, life was back to normal, and my uncle hadn't thought about his old bar friend for quite a while. Then, one day, he received a letter from the county courthouse summoning him for jury duty. He didn't think much of it, as it was a typical civic duty that most people got called to at some point. He marked his calendar and, on the scheduled day, showed up at the courthouse, expecting the usual process. Wait around, listen to some briefings, and possibly sit through a mundane case or two. However, as he entered the courtroom and took his seat among the jury pool, he noticed that the atmosphere was unusually tense. He could feel a strange energy in the room, a sense of heaviness. Curious, he leaned over to a fellow potential juror and whispered, "Do you know what this case is about?" The person beside him looked at him with wide eyes and muttered, "It's a big one. They say it's for a suspected serial killer." My uncle's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't expected to be part of something this serious. Trying to shake off the nerves, he sat up straight, focusing on the case that was about to unfold. Then, as the court session began, the doors opened, and the accused was escorted into the room by security. My uncle turned to see the man being led into the courtroom and felt his breath catch. It was his friend from the bar. For a moment, he couldn't process what he was seeing. He stared in shock, trying to reconcile the friendly face he knew with the gravity of the accusations that hung over the courtroom. How could it be the same person? The man who had laughed with him, shared stories with him, and seemed so normal, so nice, was now standing accused of unthinkable crimes. As the trial began, the details of the case were laid out in excruciating detail. My uncle sat in disbelief as he listened to the charges, the evidence, and the accounts of people who had crossed paths with this man in much darker circumstances. Bit by bit, the image of his friendly bar acquaintance was replaced with a stranger, a figure capable of acts that went beyond anything he could have ever imagined. The experience left him shaken to his core. Even after the trial was over and he went back to his normal routine, the memory lingered. How could someone he thought he knew, someone he'd shared drinks and stories with, turn out to be hiding such a dark, sinister side? To this day, my uncle talks about it only occasionally, almost as if speaking about it too often would make it feel too real. But when he does, there's a strange look in his eyes, a mix of disbelief and something close to sadness. It serves as a reminder that sometimes we really have no idea who the people around us truly are. The invitation came in the form of a small, worn-out envelope, with my name scrawled across it in a handwriting that seemed oddly unfamiliar, yet somehow comforting. It had been over a decade since I'd last heard anything from my cousin's family, and we'd only spoken briefly a few times by phone. So when I received this unexpected invitation to a dinner at his home, I was surprised, even a bit hesitant. I'd never met my cousin face-to-face before, and all I had was a vague memory of my mother mentioning them from time to time, always with a hint of mystery. The address was peculiar. My GPS couldn't recognize it, displaying an error whenever I tried to load directions. Reluctantly, I resorted to pinning the location on an old map, and after a quick glance, I realized it was well off any route I'd ever taken, situated somewhere in the more remote countryside. Still, curiosity got the better of me. I packed my things, got in my car, and set out as twilight began to stretch across the sky. As I drove, the surroundings gradually began to change. Streetlights disappeared, replaced by the dense cover of trees that arched over the road, their dark branches crisscrossing in an almost sinister canopy. I passed endless rows of empty fields, the occasional rundown barn, and not a single house in sight. The sense of isolation crept up on me, making the hairs on the back of my neck prickle. I glanced at my phone, still no signal. The silence of the countryside was unnerving, broken only by the soft hum of my car's engine. "Where the hell am I going?" I muttered, casting a wary glance around. But I pressed on, hoping the dinner would be worth this eerie detour. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I spotted an address that closely matched the one on the invitation. The house itself was a grim spectacle, almost hidden by the thicket of trees and undergrowth that had overgrown around it. Moss clung to its sides, and thick vines wove across the crumbling walls. It looked like no one had lived there in years. "This can't be it," I whispered, feeling a strange dread settle over me. Still, as soon as I turned into the driveway, two figures emerged from the dimly lit front porch. They were smiling, waving me over. My aunt and uncle. Despite the unsettling state of the house, they seemed delighted to see me, rushing over to greet me with warm hugs, as though we'd known each other for years. Come in," they said, ushering me inside before I could ask any questions. The interior was surprisingly inviting, if a bit worn and outdated. I could smell something delicious wafting from the kitchen, pot roast maybe, and my stomach rumbled. My aunt had gone all out, setting up the dining room with platters of food and old family photo albums on display, each one yellowed and dusty. They invited me to sit, and as we waited for my cousin, who they said had run a few errands, we chatted about family, catching up on years' worth of stories. They asked me about my mom, how she was doing, and reminisced about memories I didn't even know they had shared. At times, their knowledge of family details seemed oddly specific, as though they had been watching from afar all these years. I was put off, but chalked it up to the excitement of reconnecting. Dinner was surprisingly pleasant, and my aunt's cooking was incredible. We ate until I was stuffed, and afterward they suggested a game of Uno, pulling out an old, worn deck from the shelf. We played for hours, laughing and bantering, and as the sky darkened outside, I realized just how isolated we truly were. There wasn't a sound beyond the walls. No distant hum of cars, no animals, just a dense silence that seemed to press in on the house. Eventually, I checked my watch. It was nearing 9 p.m. and my cousin still hadn't returned. I felt a creeping discomfort and decided it was time to head back. I politely told them I had to leave, explaining that I had work the next morning. The moment I said it, their expressions changed. My aunt gave me an almost pitying look. "You're not planning on driving back now, are you? It's dark, and these roads are tricky even in daylight." My uncle chimed in, looking visibly uneasy. "Stay the night. We have the guest room all made up for you. It's much safer." The insistence in their voices was unsettling, as if there was something they weren't telling me. I forced a smile and assured them that I could navigate my way back just fine, brushing off their worried glances. But when I stood up, they blocked my way, both of them now with pleading expressions. "Please," my aunt whispered. "You don't know what's out there. It's not safe to leave now." A strange chill ran down my spine, and a sense of urgency flared within me. I couldn't explain it, but something felt off. These people, though polite and familiar, seemed almost desperate to keep me there. It was as if they had been waiting for something. Waiting for me. With a tight smile, I nodded and pretended to relent. "Fine, I'll stay," I said, watching their expressions soften with relief. But as soon as they went to fetch the bedding, I darted out the front door, slipping quietly into my car and starting the engine. The wheels crunched over the gravel as I tore out of the driveway, my hands shaking as I gripped the steering wheel. The house, with its dark windows and shadowed corners, disappeared quickly in my rearview mirror, swallowed up by the night. Driving out of that desolate area was just as difficult as getting there. I was lost for what felt like hours, retracing routes, narrowly avoiding trees that loomed like shadowy figures on either side of the narrow road. At last, a familiar road sign appeared, and I sped up, feeling a wave of relief as I finally left that dreadful place behind. By the time I arrived home, it was well past 11 p.m. Not wanting to wake my parents, I climbed over the fence and slipped in through the back door, careful to make as little noise as possible. But as soon as I stepped into the kitchen, I froze. The lights were on, and there was my mom, sitting at the table, arms crossed and a deeply concerned expression on her face. "Where were you?" she asked, her voice tight with worry. I blinked, confused. I was at Aunt Deborah's house. You knew this. They invited me for dinner. Her face paled. Aunt Deborah called hours ago, she whispered. She said you never showed up. I stood there, staring at her, my mind racing. My aunt had called? But I had just spent the entire evening with her and my uncle. I had eaten their food, sat at their table, laughed and played games in their old creaky house. And yet, an icy chill crept over me as I replayed the night's events in my mind, the unsettling details surfacing now with sharp clarity. The strange address, the dilapidated house, my cousin who never showed up, and my aunt and uncle's insistence that I stay the night. Till this day, I never knew who I visited. It was a rainy Saturday night. I was out in a restaurant with some friends having a great time. It was almost midnight and we had to leave. We came out, said our goodbyes, and I walked towards my car. I got in and started driving towards my home. I had a long day and was really tired. It was about an hour's drive to my house. On my way, I started to feel sleepy, so I turned on the radio to keep me awake. But there was some problem with the radio. All I could hear was static. I was checking the radio when, suddenly, I saw someone standing straight ahead in the middle of the road. I severed left and applied the brakes hard. The car screeched to a stop. I got out of the car to check, but there was no one there. I looked around where I saw the person standing, but there was no one to be seen around. No person, no tire marks, no indication that anything happened. I thought that my mind was playing tricks on me. I was just really sleepy. I went back to my car, checked the car. Everything seemed to be working except the radio. I was a little shaky after that incident and went on to drive slowly towards my home. I reached home at 1 a.m. Just as I got in, my phone rang. It was Andy, one of the friends with whom I was having dinner earlier tonight. He sounded worried, and he said that he was calling to check that I reached home safely or not. I told him that I was okay and asked what the matter was. He sounded confused and scared. He told that while driving home on the way he saw a guy who looked just like me standing there in the middle of the road. He thought that he had hit me with his car, but when he went out to see, there was no one there. That was very weird. I said that even I experienced the same thing. He said that he had called the other two friends too, and even they saw something similar. He started to panic. I told him not to think about it too much right now and just go to bed. We'll figure this out tomorrow. After the call, I took a nice hot shower and then went to bed. Next morning, the four of us had decided to meet at the same restaurant and discuss the events of last night. I reached there early, only to see that the restaurant had been burned down to the ground. The entire place had just been completely destroyed by the fire. There were paramedics and firemen checking for any survivors and trying to get the dead bodies out. I saw an onlooker standing at the side or the road and went up to him to ask what had happened there. He told that there was a fire last night, a big one. No one survived. All the people were trapped inside the building. No one could call the fire department as all the phone lines were destroyed. The fire engines and the paramedics came in the morning when everyone was already dead. I felt that was very strange, as we had just had dinner there last night. I went towards the road to wait for my friends. As I was going, I saw one of the paramedics taking a dead body out. It was charred, but somehow the face looked familiar. I looked closer, and then I remembered where I had seen him. I was talking to him a couple minutes ago. I turned back to see, but he was gone. I started freaking out, thinking that Did I really see a ghost? The paramedic placed the dead body next to another one. Coincidentally, it also looked familiar. To my surprise, this was the person who I'd seen last night, the one I thought that I almost hit with my car. But from his wounds, it looked like he had died there in the fire too. My head was starting to spin. What was going on? It was as if suddenly I was seeing ghosts everywhere. By this time, my friend Andy reached there too and was shocked to see the place burned down. "How is that even possible?" he said. "We were almost the last ones out of here, and the owner said that they had to close the place." "Yeah, I know. It is all very weird. This place burning down and me suddenly seeing ghosts everywhere." "What ghosts?" Andy asked. I told him about the dead bodies lying there and how I had seen the same guy last night and then today morning too. "That is strange," Andy said. "I did not see any ghost, but I remember seeing you last night in front of my car." Just as he spoke those words, I saw the paramedics carry out 4 more bodies: Andy, me, and our 2 other friends. All 4 were burned. I looked at Andy, then at my burned and lifeless body, being carried away right in front of my eyes. The house was blanketed in silence, an uneasy calm settling over everything. My husband had left a while ago, just to pick up a few things he'd forgotten, and I'd been waiting for him to come back. I'd tried to distract myself, reading on the couch, but the ticking of the clock seemed louder than usual, filling the empty space. I kept glancing at the door, hoping he'd return soon. He was taking longer than I expected. Then, just as I began to nod off, a noise jolted me awake. A faint rustling outside the door. I held my breath, listening. It was so quiet I could have dismissed it as the wind, but there it was again, a subtle scratching sound, like someone or something was fumbling with the lock. My pulse quickened. I told myself it was probably nothing, that I was being paranoid. But as I sat up, the sound grew louder, now unmistakably deliberate, as though someone was testing the lock, pushing against it, trying to get in. Fear prickled up my spine, and without thinking, I darted into the bedroom and slipped into the closet, pulling the door almost closed, but leaving a tiny crack to see through. I crouched low, willing my breath to steady, listening for any movement. And then, just as I huddled into the shadows, I felt an arm wrap around my shoulders, a firm, familiar grip that pulled me back. I almost screamed, but then relief flooded over me. It was my husband. He must have come in quietly, heard the same noises I had, and slipped into the closet to hide with me. I leaned into him, heart still pounding, but now with the comfort of his presence. His arm stayed around me, his hand warm and steady on my shoulder, offering silent reassurance. We crouched there together, side by side, listening. The front door creaked open. Someone had come inside. The soft thud of footsteps filled the house, slow and measured, as if the intruder was in no rush, taking their time with each step. My husband's arm tightened around me, grounding me as the footsteps moved through the rooms, approaching the hallway, drawing closer to our hiding place. I held my breath, every nerve on edge, straining to hear every movement. I could feel my husband's steady presence behind me, his hand gripping mine now, a silent promise that we'd get through this together. But the footsteps stopped right outside the bedroom door. The doorknob turned, and the door swung open with a low creak. My husband's grip on my hand grew firmer, anchoring me as we stayed as still as possible, hoping the intruder wouldn't notice us. Silence stretched out, thick and tense, before a familiar voice suddenly broke it. "Hey, babe, I'm back. I forgot my keys." It was my husband's voice, calling out cheerfully from the front door. The world seemed to tilt. My body went rigid, my blood freezing in my veins. My husband was outside. He had just come home. If he was at the door, then who was in the closet with me? A wave of dread crashed over me, a sickening realization twisting in my stomach. I felt the weight of the arm still around my shoulders, warm and solid, the hand still gripping mine, fingers intertwined with mine as if nothing were wrong. Every instinct told me to run, to scream, but fear kept me rooted in place, my body locked in terror. Slowly, carefully, I pulled my hand away, my skin crawling as I felt the grip loosen, allowing my hand to slip free. I could barely breathe, my mind racing, heart pounding as I tried to process the horror of what was happening. Outside, I could hear my husband's footsteps, his voice calling out again, growing louder as he made his way down the hall. "Babe, are you here?" The presence beside me didn't move, didn't flinch, just stayed there, utterly still, as if waiting. My husband's footsteps approached the bedroom door, and as he entered, the weight beside me shifted, the arm pulling back, retreating into the shadows. I stumbled forward, almost falling out of the closet, gasping for air as I rushed toward my husband, my body shaking with terror. He caught me, his eyes widening in confusion and concern as he steadied me. "You must remain in the room while I dine," he told me 3 years ago. "But face the wall and do not turn around until I've eaten every last crumb." I nodded. I will tell you when I've finished," he interrupted, anticipating my question. When I made the mistake of breaking his only rule, I saw something terrifying. I can't reveal this figure's identity, safety reasons. I've been lying low since February, hoping never to encounter him again. I moved from Los Angeles to Toronto, putting thousands of miles and natural barriers between us. Yet, I feel eyes on me every day, as if he's watching, ready to silence me. I'm not asking you to run from LA. Nowhere is truly safe from him. But by sharing this story, I'm hoping he'll have no reason to harm me. You're about to learn the truth, so he'll have to tread carefully. This is someone whose name is known worldwide. I cooked his lunches and dinners daily from November 2021 to February 2024. But one lunchtime, my curiosity led to my last day of employment. The meal was simple: a flatbread topped with spring onions, chili flakes, and feta. A modest lunch for a modest man. Nothing extravagant, nothing strange. I don't know why I looked. For 3 years, I'd followed his only rule without question. He paid a small fortune, so I never dreamed of breaking it, until that one ordinary day in late February. I placed the flatbread on the table, then stood at the counter focusing on the wall ahead, waiting while he ate. The sounds he made were unsettling. Smacks, slurps, crunches, louder and more intense than usual. I've never had an issue with the sounds of people eating, but this was different. This sounded like more than one person. Sometimes I could swear I heard faint, far-off voices, almost like a conversation, muttering about places and times long past. This tells us, in the mountains of Malaysia, 400 years ago, those murmurs were too soft to make out clearly, and the slurping took most of my focus. I tried serving softer foods, hoping they'd quiet the noise, but nothing worked. Over time, I'd imagined countless explanations. Nothing made sense. And eventually I broke. Something compelled me to turn. The man wasn't eating in any normal sense. The sides of his face had opened like peeling fruit, revealing no muscle or bone beneath. Instead, there was a crater inside his head, where he was shoveling bits of my carefully prepared flatbread. This wasn't a mouth. The food was meeting a set of rolling, glassy orbs with strange colors and patterns, as if it were being absorbed for secrets, not sustenance. I was frozen, and he noticed me. He stopped, mid-bite, his strange eyes swiveling to look at me. Then his body trembled, and his hand crushed the flatbread to crumbs. I backed toward the door, unable to stop the tiny whimper escaping my mouth. He didn't have to get up to reach me. He thrust his hand forward, and something long and sinuous slid from his palm. The scaly appendage snapped across the room, brushing my back as I fled into the hallway, reaching for the front door. In that moment, I thought of his many flings over the years, all the people who had moved on. I couldn't help but wonder what had really happened to them. I fumbled with the lock, finally made it outside, and stumbled onto the driveway. The fine prick of something sharp grazed my back, sending pain down my spine. I kept running, driven by fear. I don't remember much of what followed. Somehow, I ended up in Toronto, having abandoned everything I knew. But this nightmare isn't over. For months, I felt eyes on me. I'm certain he eats more than just food. I'll handle my own breakfasts, he firmly told me back in 2021. Are you sure? I make a mean, you would not want to cater to my morning needs, he replied, almost growling. This isn't just about telling my story, it's a warning. No matter how good the money, think twice before becoming a celebrity's private chef in LA. The snow fell quietly, blanketing the small rural town of Black Springs in a thick, unbroken sheet. My cottage sat on the edge of the village, surrounded by dense forest. The trees, heavy with snow, formed a natural barrier around me, their twisted branches casting shadows even on the brightest days. At night, the woods became an endless, silent void, filled with an unsettling stillness. I had come here seeking peace, hoping to escape my past and find a way forward. Earlier that day, I had a moment of weakness and found myself at the local shop, buying a bottle I had sworn to leave behind. Back in my small kitchen, the familiar scent of whiskey filled the air as I twisted off the cap. I felt that old pull, the memories of late nights and blurred thoughts. My hands trembled as I approached the sink. Shadow, my black cat, perched atop the fridge, watched me with an intensity that almost seemed to hold a hint of understanding. His tail flicked, and he tilted his head, silently waiting. With a shaky breath, I tipped the bottle, letting the amber liquid swirl down the drain, marking a step forward. Shadow let out a soft purr, leapt down, and rubbed against my leg, his warmth a small comfort. I thought that would be the end of it. But as night fell, the quiet took on a different quality. Later, I curled up in the living room, nursing a cup of tea as the snow continued to fall, blanketing everything outside in an almost oppressive silence. Shadow sat by the window, his eyes trained on the woods, his ears twitching at each creak and groan of the old cottage. The silence seemed to press in on me, amplifying every fear I'd tried to leave behind. Then, suddenly, the old clock radio in the kitchen crackled to life. My heart skipped a beat. I hadn't turned it on. The song that began to play was one I knew all too well. Sweet Dreams Are Made of This by Eurythmics. The familiar tune sounded distorted and warped, as if coming from somewhere distant. It was a reminder of the life I was trying to leave behind, now intruding on this quiet refuge. I hurried into the kitchen, pulled the plug from the wall, and stood there, my breathing heavy in the silence that followed. Shadow had followed, his back arched, eyes wide. The air felt thick, an invisible weight pressing down on us. Then came a sound. Tap, tap, tap. It came from the living room window. The forest bordered that side of the house, and I imagined something hidden in the trees, watching. I whispered to myself, "It's just the wind." But Shadow didn't seem convinced. He hissed, his fur bristling, before darting under the couch. The tapping grew louder, moving toward the back of the house. My heart pounded as I reached for my phone, only to find the battery dead. A knock echoed through the cottage, deep and unsettling, as if something outside was demanding to be let in. I edged towards the front door, each step slow, every muscle tense. A second knock came, sharper this time. I pulled the door open, hoping to find a neighbor, but no one was there. The snow fell softly, erasing any footprints. The forest loomed beyond the yard, dark and foreboding. I closed the door and locked it, a chill settling over me. The faint scent of whiskey lingered in the air, and when I turned, my heart froze. The bottle of whiskey sat on the counter, as full as when I'd brought it home, though I had poured it all out. A note was stuck to the glass, the words scrawled in jagged letters. "Drink me. Escape." My hands shook as panic crept in. The bottle felt like a ghost from my past, refusing to let me go. A voice, cold and insistent, whispered in my mind, "Just a taste." Escape. Shadow emerged from his hiding spot, his eyes wide and alert. I felt a surge of resolve. I grabbed the bottle and threw it at the shadow that seemed to be forming in the corner of the room. The glass shattered, spilling whiskey across the floor, and the shadow recoiled, dissolving back into the darkness. Exhausted, I slumped to the floor, Shadow settling into my lap, his small, warm body a comfort against the tension that filled the room. But the quiet didn't last long. The tapping returned, louder than before, and I felt a cold draft, as if a window had somehow opened. I looked up and froze. A tall, gaunt figure with hollow eyes stood in the doorway, his mouth twisted into a chilling smile. "You can't escape," he whispered, his voice low and mocking. "We're always here." I tried to steady myself, backing up toward the corner. But Shadow leapt forward, hissing and clawing, his small form fierce. The figure stumbled, his form flickering in and out of the shadows. I seized a heavy candlestick from the table and swung, connecting with a resounding crack. The figure dissolved into darkness, leaving the room silent once more. The first light of dawn crept through the curtains, casting a soft glow over the snow outside. Everything looked peaceful, almost serene, but I knew better. The forest beyond my window was still and silent, but it hid unseen shadows. Shadow curled up beside me, purring softly. I knew he was more than just a pet. He was my guard, my constant companion in the struggle. And as I took a deep breath, feeling the warmth of the morning sun, I knew the battle with the darkness was far from over. But for now I was safe. And that, I realized, was enough.